Hello and welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken, and with me as usual is my co-host and associate editor, Tho Bishop, here from the Mises Institute. And on this episode of Radio Rothbard, we are going to be talking about predictions for 2023. This is our year-end episode. And we're going to bring you all the great things that we think are going to happen in 2023. And by great, I mean large and significant. I don't mean happy. I don't mean good. So, although maybe we'll find some good stuff in there to be happy about. So we might as well just get going and start talking about what we think is going to happen in 2023. At this point, we hope you've had a Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays. And get ready for the new year. Because I think it's going to be a lot of the same negative trends, but with a twist. And I think 2023 is when we find out really what the next several years are going to look at. 2022 seems to have been kind of a year where things were on hold, right? The voters didn't seem to have quite picked up on the fact that the economy was significantly souring. So they just basically voted for the status quo in Congress for the most part. And I think, however, the reality is going to come home a bit more in 2023. So, why don't we go ahead and let you just start off with your first prediction, and we'll just go ahead and go from there.
Yeah, I'm going to start off with, we're going to go outside of our borders here. We're going to take a cheery look at Europe. And my prediction is that in 2023, we're going to see at least one fairly prominent right-wing political party completely taken off the map. That they are going to, we got a little taste of this a couple weeks ago with the thwarted plot in Germany of, was it Prince Heinrich the 13th or something like that, with 22 people that had a plot to reinstall the monarchy within Germany. There were some connections there with members of the Alternative for Deutschland party. And I think that they are setting the stage that when you consider the escalating economic concerns, amplified by, again, whatever the state of the Ukrainian-Russian war and its consequences economically within Europe, when you consider some of the political environment is very tenuous. You see success of right-wing parties. We had the Italian prime minister, went over there from a right direction. I think that you're going to have kind of the gloves come off, and that again, it wouldn't surprise me at all. I think AfD is perhaps one of the more likely contenders for this title. But really, you've seen success with a variety of European political parties on the right attracting younger people that are upset with their own prospects right now. And again, I think you're going to have Brussels bureaucrats really try to ramp up the iron fist of smiley face, liberal democracy, and that some of these right-wing parties are going to be completely banned from running for public office.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that freedom of speech isn't really a thing in Europe the same way it is in the United States. And once upon a time, I might have said North America or the English-speaking world or something like that, but that's not even the case anymore. It's really just the United States that draws a pretty hard line on freedom of speech. And in these other countries, including Canada, it's not really a prominent part of their bills of rights if they have one. And you can be arrested in Scotland for criticizing Islam. You can be arrested and imprisoned for saying nasty things about Jews. And so while those things are certainly rude and unsavory, and I certainly wouldn't say them myself, but jailing people for saying things has hundreds of years of backstory in terms of the free world fighting against that sort of thing. I mean, it goes back at least to 16th century England, where excuses over saying things against the monarch enabled the executive power to imprison you. And so that never really went out of style, especially on the continent in Europe. So, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all. And I mean, you can see this just by talking to Europeans casually a lot of the time. They think it's bonkers if you just let people say anything, because the next thing you know, people are Nazis. So people aren't really moral agents responsible for their own actions. And it shouldn't, I guess it's not, you shouldn't just prosecute murder and mayhem, which are real crimes, but instead you have to nip it in the bud by arresting people for saying things. And that's just a completely different attitude over there than it is in places that have a bigger taste of liberalism in the 19th century style. And that just never really got that big of a foothold on the continent over there, and it seems to have been abandoned in England. So I think that'll just be a big story in 2023 in general, is how much under siege will freedom of speech be, not just in Europe, but in the United States.
Yeah, and obviously they've already kind of planted that seeds a little bit, within what's happened with the January 6th committees and all that sort of stuff, Republican Party here at home. But again, it's going to be amplified, on a different scale. And there's the other dynamic is that these governments are richer, they're more coordinated through the EU, whereas trying to do similar attempts at crackdowns down and some South American governments, right? There's some advantage that Europe has with the political power. And again, I think this is going to be a edict on high as well to help coordinate this sort of stuff. Because again, I think there are concerns about the stability. I think every regime out there has concerns about stability within because the craziness of the past year. And again, I don't think they're going to take this stuff laying down. So again, that is a starting off with a very pessimistic prediction here. But we can perhaps. Do you have anything cheerier? Maybe not.
Well, I mean, the stuff that isn't directly related to clamping down on dissidents. We'll just look at some economic news. The issue is what's the Fed going to do in 2023? And I did an article recently for Mises.org looking at just how much pressure the Fed is going to come under in terms of raising its 2% inflation target. And you're seeing tons of pressure coming out of Wall Street on that. The Wall Street Journal's writing articles about it. It was significant that during his last press conference, Powell got one question about raising the target. And who asked the question? Some hack from Fox Business. So you could see, this guy, these Fox Business people, they really want that inflation target to go up so that the Fed can keep pumping and start pumping again. Because if the Fed just says, oh, we're raising the inflation target to 4%, well, then they don't have nearly as far to go in terms of bringing inflation back down. So, hey, we brought it back down to 4.5%. That's close enough. So now we can start lowering interest rates again and get ready for more easy money. So this idea of getting it all the way back down to 2% CPI inflation is just way too much for Wall Street to stomach right now, because that's what they're addicted to. There is no Wall Street doesn't think in terms of capital expenditure and building factories and hiring people and really investing in companies. All they really want is to be able to take a bunch of money, stick it in some investment instrument, and collect a bunch of returns without any real risk. And ideally, they'll even get bailed out if anything happens. So there's no sense of any real corporate investment in the future. The real money just comes from really just playing the stock market casino. And that's the game on Wall Street now. Yeah, of course, there's oddballs who are really interested in building something. But that's not what's sexy in Wall Street. So it's all just about, we want more easy money from the Fed. There's no real capitalism going on at all. Just keep it coming. And so it's just countless articles about how the Fed needs to pivot, the Fed needs to reverse, the Fed needs to get easy money going again. The Fed's going to go too far. It's going to cut easy money too much. It's going to raise interest rates too much. And then we'll have a recession. Well, guess what? The recession was already baked in as soon as you started having this huge boom. You can't have the huge boom without the bust. Wall Street still doesn't seem to have figured that out, except for the Austrians, of course, who are in the tiny minority. And so it's just really quite remarkable to see that you're actually hearing a lot more resistance from Wall Street than even on the Hill, which I guess maybe Congress is smart enough to just let Wall Street carry its water for it. So that they're like, well, we don't have to protest constantly about high interest rates. We'll just let Wall Street do that for us. And then, of course, the other issue, too, is they've got to bring interest rates back down. They can't just let them keep going up, because then debt service on the national debt will just keep going up and up. And if you look at the quarterly data on federal outlays related to interest paid on the debt, it's just at huge levels. I mean, really quite remarkable. It's back to now during that period after the 1970s when suddenly interest rates skyrocketed up about 12% in terms of the prime rate, which was doable back then because there wasn't nearly as much debt. But now you could imagine if interest rates were to go up to 5, 6, 7, 8% here, that would just completely break the bank. It would overwhelm federal spending. It would require cuts in Social Security and Medicaid and, worst of all, defense, of course, which Mitch McConnell's out there saying that winning the war in Ukraine's the number one priority for Republicans right now. I mean, unbelievable. You got the economy is like on a knife's edge, and they're talking about some defending the United States against some podunk country, Russia, that's only a threat to the U.S. if the U.S. provokes it into nuclear war. And we'll cover that later. But that's apparently the Republican priority, at least according to Mitch McConnell. So I think that all just demonstrates just how much pressure is coming down on the Fed right now. And I will be shocked if they stick with the 2%. I could see them not officially abandoning the 2%, but still declaring, well, we've got things under control. It's down to 4%, and we're headed in the right direction. So now we can reverse course and get the asset purchases going again and just not raise interest rates any further. So I think that's going to be the story in 2023.
Well, I mean, there has been talk for a while about sort of the average inflation rate. So it's like, you don't really have to hit 2% all the time, right? We were underneath 2% for a while, so now it's fine to, coast around 4. It all evens out at the end, right? No, I think you're right. And what's interesting is, again, the Fed hasn't really faced this sort of political wins in a very long time. At least of my lifetime. I read stories about the great protests during the late 70s, 80s, the Volcker moment and all that, and the mailing 2x4s to the Fed because builders couldn't afford to build houses, all that sort of stuff. You haven't had. There's been you had the Tea Party stuff. You had the Ron Paul thing where you would get a little bit of criticism beyond simply the whatever Alan Greenspan says is the word from on high. But that was always kind of on the fringe. I think that there is this dynamic where, and you're already seeing it play out, again, going back to Europe and other internationally, there's been a lot more explicit political pressure on central banks. I think we will see that ramp up on Powell. I think Powell is going to be presented as one of the great villains of 2023. He's a convenient villain for Democrats because he is nominally a Republican, even though they all voted to give him 4 more years. And I think it's going to be interesting as well that particularly people like Elizabeth Warren, who's become a lot more. I mean, she's always had. I mean, ever since she's been in the Senate, right? She's been one of the faces of regulation, that sort of stuff. But I think she is using Twitter. She's being I think more barbed than she was prior to running for president. And so I think she's going to try to cement a legacy as being, one of the big bulldog senators, over the next, however long she stays in office. Sherrod Brown from Ohio is running for re-election in a, relatively red state these days. I could see him trying to leverage, the economy and making the Fed an issue to try to help his own re-election efforts. And so, yeah, I think the political aspect of the Fed is, again, it's going to be interesting to see just how, to what degree does Powell, is he equipped to deal with the turmoil of political wins? Because he has been dealing with from Wall Street, he has been dealing it from other sources. But what happens when you really have a full political tsunami that a Fed has to steer into? And it's going to be very interesting to see. I have no idea. At this point, Powell's already overperformed. He has surprised me, honestly, from what Powell's done so far. So I'm not trying to, I'm opening up. I don't know how he will respond. I'm always cynical on this sort of stuff. We'll see. But he has yet to see the full storm of Beltway pressure placed upon his decision making.
Yeah. I mean, you can never go off what Powell says, right, or what anybody from the Fed says, but you can go off what they're doing, and he has significantly raised interest rates. There's no doubt about that. But as you mentioned, the average on the inflation target, that's just something that I should mention here just to round out, right, is that it needs to be remembered by the public that the whole 2% inflation target thing is only about 20 years old as policy. It's not some sort of like long-term Fed thing. It's not based on some sort of natural law of economics. It was just, what happened was historically, right, in the 1980s, in the late 70s, Congress passed laws saying you need to bring inflation back down. And then their goal was in the legislation, inflation needs to be 0% by 1988. And so in the Volcker moment, and they thought maybe we can get inflation really under control and down to zero. Volcker started backpedaling by the mid-'80s when he approved the Plaza Accord, which devalued the dollar. And then you had Greenspan come in. It was all about easy money. So by the mid-'90s, and Brendan Brown covers this in his book on Against 2% Inflation, in 1996, I believe it was, you got youngish Janet Yellen saying, we should really pursue this 2% target thing because 0% inflation, that's just crazy. And so that's when you start to see the warm up to that. And then when the European Central Bank came in, they officially endorsed the 2% inflation targeting in Europe. And then about, maybe 5 or 6 years later, the Fed starts seriously talking about doing it officially. So they've been yearning for that target since the 90s. And then that only lasted like 10 years, the hard 2% target, before a few years ago. Then they're saying, we need the 2% average, like you said. That way we can run above 2% in some years and just claim, it'll all even out to 2% in the long run. So now they want to just officially move it above 2%. So the next stop will be 4 or 5%, and then it'll be the 4 or 5% average, right? So, we can run 6% this year so long as it averages out to 4 years, 10 years from now. So you can just see where that's going. So it's so transparent, it's so obvious that what they're trying to do, but people have such short memories that I guess they've somehow given the impression that the 2% inflation target is some sort of scientifically arrived at thing, which of course it is no such thing at all.
Just trust the science, Ryan.
Yeah.
Just trust the science.
The science is settled. It's 2% inflation, all right, guys? We don't need to move it up. Why don't you give us your next prediction there, Tho?
Yeah, we're still looking for some optimistic news. Still looking. I will, unfortunately, this next one, not quite there yet. We're once again going to rain on your Kwanzaa Day parade. It is that Twitter, a year from now, is going to be more or less the same. that basically, I have my respect for Elon Musk has gone up a great deal over the last few months. I love his, the fact that he has essentially become a turning point influencer. And his hot takes on Twitter is, I think, a marked improvement from Obama lackey. So I appreciate New Age Elon, but I think that the economics of Twitter, as Bob and Jeff Dice mentioned on the Human Action podcast a few weeks ago, are very difficult. It seems that it seems like Elon is just absolutely miserable right now, and so the question is, is he able to find a CEO that can make Twitter profitable and has the same sort of convictions that he is talking about, and talented enough to do it in face of the fact, the scope to which, the FBI and national security agencies, which we always kind of knew, but it's still a bit jarring. We always kind of knew there was more to the JFK assassination, but then when documents come out saying the CIA really might have, killed the president, evidence kind of changes, right? There's some extra oomph there. And so I'm very skeptical of the ability for Elon, given the debt and the financial interest that helped with his investment. There's the photos of Elon at the World Cup with Jared Kushner and some very prominent Saudis. I have a feeling that we're going to see Twitter kind of return back to perhaps a little bit more, you're perhaps less obviously woke, less obviously Silicon Valley and change. I fear, though, that we're not going to get a Blake Masters CEO type in a regime that's going to end up fulfilling some of the promises that Elon, I think, genuinely wanted. I think the economics are going to strain them. I think that ultimately Twitter has the most value to powerful people as a source of as a position, as a medium of censorship, rather than as a medium of free speech. And ultimately, there's too many pressure points. There's too many vulnerabilities that Elon has as an individual. With Tesla, who's the largest marketplace for electric vehicles, right? It's people that don't like free speech, and that ultimately a year from now we're going to think back to Elon days of Twitter and saying, "Oh, that was cute. I wish it kind of worked out." It's nostalgic, but it's going to be short-lived. I would love to be wrong about this. I'd love to have let Blake Masters be CEO and let's see what he can do. I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately.
Well, I just don't think anybody's figured out how to make money with Twitter yet on a large scale. Remember, Twitter only had a profitable year in 2 years out of its entire public period. And it never made any money. All you Twitter people, you twits who worked there, and whine about how Elon ruined it and everything was great and it's not going to be profitable once you change things. You guys never made money. Okay, Twitter, you workers who think you built something so important, you never built anything that was profitable. You never built anything that actually made money. You built something that lived off gullible investors that kept buying your stock and thinking that you were going to turn into some sort of mega profitable thing at some point in the future, but you people never actually made money. It was just a playground for you. And so the fact that Elon got rid of you, that was going to happen anyway. You were going to lose your jobs. Thousands of you were going to lose your jobs anyway, the same way that Meta's cutting 10,000 jobs, the same way that Google's cutting 10,000 jobs. The whole tech vacation is over for companies like Twitter. And so Elon's come in and hasn't cracked the code either, right? The old regime didn't make money. Elon doesn't seem to know how to make money unless he figures out that, you can't just come in and maybe alienate a bunch of your audience. And so that's going to be an important issue. And so you're right. I think using it for right-wing activism probably has its limits. But the truth is the face of tech is just going to look so different without the easy money. I mean, they've had it so easy. They've just been riding high. And this was another thing Brendan Brown would cover, is that these tech monopolies, quasi-monopolies, right? Their ability to dominate and buy up other companies and potential competitors has all been fueled by easy money. It's all been reliant on the last 15 years of access to low-risk, low-interest loans that they could use for mergers and acquisitions, that they could use to feed into speculative narratives that said, hey, buy the FANG stocks. And that keeps those companies on top. But the truth is that there was never anything really inventive or special about these companies, and their CEOs weren't geniuses. And so it'll just be interesting to see what things look like a year from now, come 2024, and how do these companies manage without all that easy money. And it's hard to imagine also that they would be bailed out like the financial sector gets bailed out. Because, I mean, obviously they're going to bail out companies like AIG because that's so central to greasing the wheels of the financial system. But are they going to bail out a company like Facebook? Does that have the political oomph that would be necessary to get that if they start to have problems? I think the fact that half the Congress hates them and half the Congress loves them would probably be a real problem for them. They're not GM, right? Who, of course, gets free taxpayer money. So I think, the tech is facing a new reality they've never really faced before when you think about it, right? These companies kind of came of age Slightly before the last crisis, slightly before the Great Recession and the financial crisis, but most of their existence has been after 2009, and so I don't know that they really know much of anything about how to deal in an actually competitive world where you're just not pumping free money constantly into these industries.
Yeah, no, Twitter won't be alone in this. It's a bigger problem than Twitter. But again, I as someone who likes Twitter, I'm paying my $8 tax to King Elon right now. But yeah, I'm not overly optimistic on where this plane's going.
Well, that brings me to my next topic, which is it's all related. It's not just tech, but get ready for more collapses of these startups, right? Supposedly run by geniuses. So we've talked about FTX, right? And boy, is that a fun soap opera to watch, right? And he's, of course, facing decades in prison. His associates, like Caroline Ellison, have already turned state's witness against him, so it looks like she'll be able to minimize the amount of time she serves in prison. Same with this Gary Wang guy, who's supposed to be some sort of tech genius. Still never seen a photograph of him anywhere, some kind of like secretive tech guy. But they're now both banned from securities of all types indefinitely, is my understanding. So they're out. So now they're trying to use them to nail SBF. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that because so many of these companies, just like tech, but even more so in essentially fraudulent businesses or businesses that were all built on lies, complete lies. So you got SBF, that whole grift about being highly charitable, driving a Toyota Corolla, living in a box or whatever it was that he tried to claim. It was all just a scam. He was grifting. He was buying up millions of dollars of real estate for himself. And that was all eventually exposed, but only really because interest rates went up and it became too hard to get money to keep the grift going. And so I think you're going to see more headlines like you saw the other day with the founders of Pollen, which is this tech company that was run essentially by kind of these quintessential frat boy type tech bros. And that's now in bankruptcy. And lots of good news stories on how these guys are staying in $50,000 a night villas and living it up and having lavish parties. And then one day, oops, all the money's gone. Where'd they get their money? Venture capitalists who were just pouring their money into these worthless companies. Why? Well, because they had boatloads of money and they needed somewhere to put it. And so with so much financial repression, with interest rates so low, they were willing to take on more and more risk. So they would just stick their money anywhere where some bro promised them big returns. And that, I think that created a lot of companies which are essentially bankrupt and, of course, zombie companies and cannot survive without just taking out new huge loans at low interest. So I think it's going to be a fun year in terms of PR disasters for companies that swindled gullible investors who were just sticking their money into what should have been obviously stupid companies, like Pets.com type equivalents. If you're old enough like me to remember the .com days, Pets.com was like essentially the high watermark of the old .com boom, because it was you just bought a online domain, Pets.com, and then you kind of sold some stuff through it, and then the riches flowed. But it turned out it wasn't that easy. So this is just the modern version of that. So I look forward to reading a bunch of like horrible PR stories. One of my greatest hobbies in life is reading PR disasters online and following just public relations messes that people get into, or they say stupid things, not cancel sort of stuff where they say the wrong thing politically, but just because they're exposed as being idiots or morons or jerks or whatever. And that's always just fun to watch those things unravel. So I think you'll see a lot of that happen this year, where people who were supposedly geniuses turn out to be really, really stupid.
I'm just looking forward to the Mises Institute production company where we can just create Netflix specials on various companies imploding because of rising interest rates. Like we could do several seasons of just different companies
where we
there.
just expose faux capitalists everywhere.
Yes. It's interesting because it kind of goes, it plays directly back into the Fed predictions on next year, right? Because I mean, again, the number of zombie companies. It's interesting. This is one of those topics that when I talk to friends that are not within the Mises Institute orbit, or never even once even cracked open human action, much less read the thing. When you talk about zombie companies, like that sort of clicks with them, and they kind of realize just how kind of insane this is. And again, like the number, like I'm not gonna say that Uber is gonna disappear, next year or something like that. But there is just an incredible amount of these companies, again, notable names that have never been profitable, and when you couple either again the increased costs on debt with again the economic headwinds that so let's if you get lower interest rates, it's going to be because there's an economic environment the Fed can no longer ignore. So it's going to be one on getting at it from both sides. There's FTX is not alone. I think even the crypto space has concerns, and these concerns have been out there for a long time, right? These has always been the concerns with crypto exchanges. So the murkiness behind Binance. I know Tether has always been as a stable coin. There's always been massive concerns about the quality of the underlying assets there. We still have a lot of mess within the crypto space that needs to be dealt with. All of big tech and everything within there. The one perhaps positive silver lining on this, from years past is that you do know that, or I do know that bank reserves, banks are far more capitalized than they have in the past, and so maybe, hopefully, maybe the consequences of some of these when you do have the bust happening with some of these institutions, maybe it will be more contained than it was in some previous crises, considering how much fuel that we have added to the fire over the last 10 years, right? The concern would be that the scale is going to be so much more massive. Maybe better capitalized banks. We'll see how that really looks in headwinds, right? Maybe it will help deal with some of this stuff down the line. But yeah, it is not going to end with FTX. Again, there's going to be a lot of where it's going to create a whole new genre of docudrama of modern age financial crimes coming from the 2009 to 2022 era.
All right, Tho. Well, give us your third and final prediction for 2023.
So I didn't want to have ring in 2023 with just complete black pills. So I do have one optimistic thing, and it's something that I do believe it's significant. I think it touches on to a larger political trend that we've addressed on the website and other places, and that is that I think we are going to continue to see legislation at the state level get bolder, more radical, if you will, and help continue to fuel the differences in political outcomes being largely dictated by the state that you're living in. I think that, for example, the Arizona school choice bill, and I know there's some libertarian criticism out there, Bob Murphy, that's fine. I think that sort of model is going to be replicated elsewhere. I think that the way that DeSantis has approached both corporate welfare elements, I think that you're going to see that be replicated in other states. I think the concerns about DEI and all of the sustainability and equity and equality and company BlackRock style sort of portfolio management, the removing state funds from those actors is going to be continued. We've seen this play out already with West Virginia and Florida. I think you're going to increasingly see states talk, have the attention at the state level about the degree to which congressional state allocated funds come with strings attached that buy out sovereignty of the states. I think you're going to see state legislators kind of take a more active role in calling out some of that sort of stuff, and ideally start creating friction between state level legislatures and governors with national GOP, right? To try to, I'd love to see governors start attacking actively like Mitch McConnell. I would love to see state Republican parties, condemn DC Republican leadership. I think that dynamic is necessary because all the real, any gains that conservatives have made politically have come at the state level for quite a while now. And so I think this dynamic of policy leadership from the right coming from the state rather than the federal level, I think we're going to continue to see increased statecraft entrepreneurship, if you will, and that this is the most positive political trend, and it's the only silver lining really of the modern political landscape. And I think this trend will continue. Now, again, we're also probably setting the stage for a DeSantis versus Trump dynamic and what happens when DeSantis starts looking at the federal level. That's a whole. I'm sure that'll come up in a future episode. Spoiler alert, down the line. But as it stands right now, I think the DeSantis model of governance, I think other states following his lead, I think what other states have already done, I think that trend will continue and will create positive political dynamics that I can't even predict right now.
That would be really great. And that's been so necessary for decades now. I noticed when I worked at the state legislature is that Republicans, when they were state and local, were so much better than when they went to Washington, where they would immediately get co-opted by, back then it was sort of the Bush-style Patriot Act supporting, freedom-hating sort of agenda that the GOP supported in Washington, but you didn't hear like any of that at the state and local level. What the state and local guys talked about was cutting taxes and cutting spending and ensuring more freedom for people. And then that just all, like literally the same person would win a seat to Congress, and then it's just all out the window. Then they're all just talking about how great the police state is and wanting to give the FBI more power and everything. It's just so awful, the transformation that would take place. And they didn't care any more about taxes or spending or deficits or any of that at all. So there is a real difference between, I think, the party at the local level. The problem, of course, is that these guys at the national level have a larger microphone and they're able to command larger audiences. And so you hear all the time from some just truly despicable person like Mitch McConnell, and you're never hearing from the actual good Republicans who are in the states who are actually trying to do good things to lessen the power of the state. And so, yeah, all the dynamism, all the good stuff is going on at the state level or at the local level. There are real Austrians in a lot of state legislatures. And, of course, in state governments. I mean, I know real Austrians. I've known Austrians for years who are involved at higher levels of the bureaucracy, even in places like Colorado. So, I mean, they're out there. You just don't hear from them. And, of course, they just don't publish publicly their opinions.
All according to plan.
Right. And so that's all, of course, good. But it's so much harder to find those sorts of people in Washington. Because it's just so much more focused on maintaining the deep state at that level. And they just lose the connection then to the local community as well, and they no longer are accessible. So I would love to see then the state parties assert themselves over the federal parties. And of course, the state parties are more successful politically in many cases. They've really actually advanced their footprint in recent years, whereas what's Congress doing? In terms of they promised this red wave, they got nothing. They didn't have any sort of coherent message. Outside of a handful of guys like Thomas Massey and Rand Paul, they're uniformly awful from both parties. So, yeah, we have nothing to learn from these guys in Washington, and it would be delightful to see them getting real insults handed at them from governors, from state legislators. That's who really should be actually leading the party. But I'm no expert on how the actual internal affairs of how the party works. So you certainly know a lot more than me on that. But yeah, hopefully, I mean, I've seen signs to make your prediction seem plausible. So yeah, I certainly hope it continues in that way. And yeah, without a doubt, it has moved in that direction. Let's just hope it keeps on coming. With my third prediction, my third and final. Not nearly as
Is
much.
it uplifting?
It's not uplifting. It's not good. Sadly. So we brought you up and now we're bringing you down in the typical style of Mises.org. As editor, it's always been my pleasure to bring people down with headlines. So this one's on the war, which, of course, there's no really good news there at all. Me and Zach Yost, of course, have covered this in the War, Economy, and State podcast, right? We had one called Russia isn't winning, but Ukraine isn't either. And that's kind of the story of this, the story of war in general, right? Russia isn't going to give up on this. They are not giving up Mariupol. They want to turn the Sea of Azov into a Russian lake. They need to keep the Crimea. They want the extreme eastern part of Ukraine. That's all got to be integrated to Russia. I could see them giving up on Kherson, on some of the northeastern parts of the country, but they're working on canals from the Volga River over to the Don River that flows into the Sea of Azov. There's like a major trade project there to connect the Black Sea to Central Asia, basically, and Central Russia. And the Sea of Azov and the Crimea are key to all of that. So they're just going to keep fighting and fighting. They're not going to, all this talk about Ukraine reconquering Crimea, boy, if that happens, it's just going to be real bloody, real bad. So I just hope that doesn't even happen, especially since Crimea is mostly Russians anyway. And so it's just not worth it. Now, of course, the Ukrainians are saying, we'll fight to the last man. Well, fighting to the last man has no place in at least Catholic just war theory, and just a whole-scale murder for the sake of some goal that probably cannot be accomplished and would really just be a matter of some land changing hands. That makes sense to nationalists in terms of Western civilization, Western history. It doesn't fit in there at all in terms of actual morality. So I'm hoping, of course, for an end, for a negotiated settlement, which is, of course, how most wars have ended throughout history. This whole total and complete victory thing is a 20th century invention. But I don't think that they're going to come to their senses in 2023. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're just going to keep fighting. And then, of course, the worst case scenario is that the U.S. keeps upping the ante. Now they're sending Patriot missiles there. The Ukrainians are starting to really attack targets in Russia, which, of course, right, I mean, targets in Ukraine are being bombed, so that's tit for tat. I don't see why the Russians should be outraged about that, but it does, of course, have the potential of escalating the conflict. And so here's the thing, is escalation, when it comes to nuclear war especially, has a way of getting out of hand. That's what people don't appreciate, is that a lot of people think escalation is this very measured thing where you do this and we do that, and it's all done very rationally. They were a lot smarter about nuclear war 50 years ago. There was a lot of talk about using nukes in the Vietnam War, for example. But every time they started talking about it, the smarter people in the room said, look, you do this, you do that, and then somebody really does something we don't like, then our emotions get away from us. And then you have another escalation. And then where does this limited nuclear war end? Because that was always, it'll just be a limited nuclear war in Southeast Asia. The smart people recognize that limited nuclear wars have a way of turning into global nuclear wars. And you just look at the way escalation has worked historically. So you just want to avoid that altogether. And the Biden administration doesn't seem terribly interested in that. Just the way they keep upping the ante. So I really hope there's a change of heart on that, and that they really start to back off. I don't have a problem with Ukraine defending itself, or if they can get weapons from elsewhere. Of course, I don't think the American taxpayer should be fleeced for that, and Americans are more than welcome to voluntarily give their wealth, treasure, and time to the Ukrainians and to go over there and fight. But $80 billion is enough, especially as the economy is turning sour in the United States. Russia is no threat to the United States. It's laughable that this is considered a high priority by the Republican Party, and I'm sure by the Democratic Party as well. But it does have the potential for a grave disaster, and I don't think we're going to start to see the light at the end of the tunnel until 2023 is over and done.
of course, Zelensky just came to Washington, D.C. To ensure he gets his new big check, lets every member of Congress feel like they're a part of an Avengers movie. So at least he's, that's what he's giving back. So that's important. Self-righteousness is a very good commodity in D.C. And the problem too is that, again, like, even if Ukraine has smashing success and you have what is become the default policy of the United States and our allies is regime change in Russia. And the consequences of regime change in Russia, it would be disastrous. I mean, even if you had, let's say you have the ideal American outcome of some sort of, quasi-liberal, Karzai of Russia, right? You're going to have a breakdown of stability you're going to have so many proxy battles. I mean, like, this is a conflict that's not going to go away anytime soon. Even if the official war were to end tomorrow, battles between Ukrainian nationalists and Russian nationalists, the far right of Russia. Again, like, Putin is just a fairly centrist figure, given the scales of Russian politics right now. And it is interesting because you can definitely tell that the narrative has shifted on the war. That the Ukrainians are obviously winning. The Russians are fleeing with a tail, between their legs. Unless you're listening to Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who's convinced Russia's going to win triumphantly any day now. And I like most of his stuff, but there's you have kind of two extremes into the narrative right now. I think it's far more nuanced in the middle. I've got a buddy that has been visiting Florida who lives with his fiance in Tbilisi, in the other Georgia. I know he thinks that there's going to be, his perspective is quite not as Ukraine's got this taken care of perspective that a lot of my American friends have on the situation right now. It is, I fear that it's going to be something that is going to continue to be a storyline throughout 2023. And hopefully, come this time next year, our 2024 prediction show isn't about how to survive nuclear winter. So that would be, that is a hope for the next year.
Well, we probably won't be talking via internet if that happens. Yeah,
but that's okay. You'll be able to tune in to Radio Rothbard via landline or via a radio, transistor radio, should it need be.
Well, I'm from the 80s, so I was nursed at my mother's breast with post-apocalyptic nuclear destruction movies. They were cranking those out when I was 5 years old. Stuff like The Morning After and DEFCON 4 and all these movies about gangs of death squads eating people because that's the only food available in the nuclear winter landscape and stuff.
Even in nuclear winter, people don't want to eat the bugs. That's important. Lesson there.
I guess in case of nuclear winter, you don't have to live in pods either. So that's the good news.
So, not the worst outcome.
So a little black comedy to finish out this episode of Radio Rothbard. But of course, I'm hopeful that more sane people will prevail. I mean, it happened in 1962, but that was John F. Kennedy. I'm not exactly like Mr. I Love Kennedy. Right. He was skeptical of the CIA, and Joe Biden just doesn't seem quite in the same league. Although Curtis LeMay...
They're going to both leave office with similar brain capacity, though, so that's...
as I said, black comedy to end this episode of Radio Rothbard. So thanks for tuning in, and hope you had a wonderful 2022, and we'll see you next time for the next episode of Radio Rothbard. Have a great week.